Welcome, everyone. The event is now live. David, please take it away.
Thanks, Victoria. Okay, welcome, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the first session of today's summit, Managing and Securing Microsoft 365 Like an Expert, brought to you by CoreView and Commvault. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. And each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. Also, during today's third session, we will be giving away a GoPro Hero 10. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, CoreView and Commvault, available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of CoreView and Commvault underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Best Practices for Managing and Optimizing Microsoft 365. This session features Ben Stenjing. He is an information technology pro with extensive experience with Microsoft platforms, including Microsoft 365, SharePoint, and Azure. During his career, Ben has consulted with a wide range of organizations, ranging from 5-person shops to global enterprises in fields ranging from government to professional sports. He is also a Microsoft certified trainer and co-host of the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast. Ben, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
All right. Thanks, David, and glad to be here again joining everybody. So I hope everybody is having a wonderful Friday, and wherever you are, hopefully having some good weather, looking forward to the weekend. But we're going to dive in today, like David said, to best practices for managing, for optimizing Microsoft 365. So I've gone through various admin centers, taken some of the experience from different clients, what we've done recently, gone through some news, and come up with some of my best practices when it comes to managing and optimizing Microsoft 365. Like David said, too, as you have questions, definitely put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. I will try to keep an eye on those, too. So as they come in, too, if they're applicable to whatever topic we're talking about, try to answer some as we go, as well as leave some time at the end. You can also download the deck. I do have some links on several of the slides in this deck. So using the files, you can go get this deck as well, so you can have the links accessible to you. So getting going with managing optimizing Microsoft 365. One of the first things that I like to think about anytime I talk about this is, what are the blocks that make up Microsoft 365? Over the years, it has expanded, and there's lots of different components within Microsoft 365 that all work together to make up the product suite. And one of my first ones that I tend to see when I come into companies, when I tend to talk to people, is sometimes the mindset from maybe on-premises or from 15 or 20 years of a little bit more siloed responsibilities or siloed understandings come into play. When you think about, I'm just managing Exchange, or I'm managing SharePoint or Active Directory. A lot of those products still exist when you get into Microsoft 365. You still have Microsoft Entra. You have the various product admin centers. You have Exchange, you have SharePoint, you have the Power Platform, you have Teams. But you also have things like the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, where it spans all of the products. The Security Center, Microsoft Defender XDR, or Purview, that have different impacts on all of them. Even some of the configurations have moved, where Exchange, you used to manage some of the anti-phishing policies, anti-spam policies from within Exchange. Those are all over in the Security Center now. When you think about things like data loss prevention, that being over in Purview. So there becomes more and more of a need for managing Microsoft 365 to at least have a few people within your company, within your organization, whether that's you or somebody else, that understand not just the blocks that make up Microsoft 365 at a high level, but how all of these different blocks fit together, how they interact with each other, where you maybe have dependencies on other ones. Teams, for example, having its files in SharePoint and tying into a mailbox and Exchange, where you don't get the full Teams experience unless you're also on Exchange Online and SharePoint Online. How you can leverage the Microsoft Graph to go out and connect to all these various products, these different areas of Microsoft 365 to perform certain activities, whether it's writing scripts or doing custom development. The Microsoft Graph is there. So that first step, I say, when you get into managing Microsoft 365 is go in and understand these blocks that make up Microsoft 365. Maybe you don't have to understand all the details. You may have different people that excel in different areas, and we're going to talk about different aspects of these different blocks as we keep going. But again, making sure that there's that understanding of that Microsoft 365 in some respects is a product, and you're managing Microsoft 365 as a whole to a certain extent as you're going out and deploying different workloads and various features. So diving into these different blocks and working through some of them. The first one is Microsoft Entra. I always start with Microsoft Entra. It's where you manage your identity within Microsoft 365. Even if you're one of those enterprises, you have Active Directory on premises yet, you're synchronizing users up to Microsoft 365, you're still synchronizing them up to Microsoft Entra. There's still different layers of management that you are performing within Microsoft Entra. The first of these is what we just said, the identity. Your users, whether it's the properties of those users, things like addresses and offices and locations and phone numbers, email aliases, making sure you're managing all of those, you're updating those. But then when it comes to managing Microsoft 365 with those identities, those users and those passwords, is one of my first tips is used privileged identity management. This is one of those features. You don't need it for everybody. It's included in your Entra ID Plan 2. And if I say Azure AD, I'm sorry, it's been Azure AD for like 10 years. That is still stuck in my head. I can still tend to flip them back and forth. But Entra ID, privileged identity management, what this does is, especially for your administrators, go out and license Microsoft Entra ID Plan 2 if you don't have it. So you can take advantage of privileged identity management. So these administrator accounts, and whether you split out your normal user from your admin account, or whether you just have one account that you use for administration and your normal everyday activities, whatever account you use when you go perform administrative activities, you should really look at having privileged identity management enabled. This allows that user that you log in with to not have admin activity or admin level access by default, whether this is a global admin or a user management admin, your Exchange admin, your SharePoint admin, your security admin. You can go in and set up various functionality within privileged identity management so that these accounts that perform these activities are normal everyday accounts. When they need to go in and perform those administrative activities, they can go in, elevate their account to that particular admin level for a set period of time. After that set period of time, that level of administration is going to go away. Their account is going to revert to a normal account. Well, what this does is if you have leaked credentials, or if there's some script that they are running, something that malware that gets on their computer that tries to access the admin center or perform admin activities, it's not going to be allowed to do that because that account isn't going to be an admin by default. The other thing this does is it allows people, when they do elevate to only the admin level that they need. For instance, my account, a lot of times, I'll have multiple different admin roles that I can elevate to as within privileged identity management. Maybe I have like an Intune admin, I will have a global admin, SharePoint admin, Exchange admin, and Teams admin. If I'm going to go work in Intune, I'll just elevate my account to an Intune admin. That way I know it's not going out and doing a bunch of stuff I don't need to be doing right now. Same thing with the SharePoint or Exchange admin. So this is one of mine. If you have the ability to get it, go out and turn on privileged identity management. Another one I see a lot is not everyone needs to be a global admin. It is very easy to go in and say, you know what, this user has to perform admin activities. I'm just going to make them a global admin. That way I don't have to think about exactly what they're doing. It's easy. But it's a risk. If you have 10, 15, 20 global admins, and really those people only need Teams admin access, or they only need user admin because all they're ever doing is managing users or resetting passwords, there's no reason to go in and make them a global admin. If it's maybe an executive that wants to be able to see everything, I've seen this before too. Don't make them a global admin. Go give them global reader. Most of the time, your C-levels, your executives aren't going to be going in there and changing stuff. Maybe they want to see stuff. They want to have awareness of how stuff is configured. Start with at least that global reader so they can go in and see stuff, but you know that stuff isn't going to get changed. So a couple things around identity when it comes to some of those best practices. Best practices around protection within Microsoft Entra. I talk about this on every single session I do. I always figure out a way to get this one in there, is conditional access. Go in, set up different policies in your environment so you know where people are accessing it from, or you're restricting where can people access it from, how can they access your environment, whether this is they have to be on our network in order to access our environment. There's some new stuff around that bottom bullet point, global secure access, where you set it up so they need to be connected to global secure access in order to access your environment. Maybe you don't want them to be able to download information out of your environment to certain devices. Going in and setting up conditional access, this continues to expand. Every month, I feel like I go in and there's new settings, new buttons, new levers that you can turn, set, check, and conditional access to even further refine that protection of your Microsoft 365 environment in other applications that are tied to it. Going into that app registrations. Know what applications are registered to your environment and how your app registrations are configured. Go in and make sure that users can't automatically trust applications to all of your environment or to enable them for org-wide access. There's settings you can go into app registrations where users, if they're going in and adding an application into their Exchange, some add-in, or tying in a third-party application to SharePoint, it actually goes to an administrator. So that admin has to approve those app registrations. You can set things up too, so maybe like trusted, verified applications, something like a DocuSign, you're going to allow users to do. But some of these other third-party app registrations, you may not want your users to do. They may introduce security risks, or maybe you have certain policies and regulations where you have to review application registrations before users are allowed to grant those applications access to their data. A lot of people, frankly, don't even know all the app registrations that exist in your environment. So going in and doing regular reviews of those. Thinking through authentication is another one. Microsoft continues to continues to implement additional authentication controls within Entra ID. One of the big ones, and this has come up, is like token stealing. Some type of attack where they're getting tokens, replicating you, going in and setting up authentication policies. So maybe you're using FIDO keys and you're using some of those phishing-resistant authentication methods, cert-based authentication. Stop using SMS if you can. SMS is, well, it is MFA. It's probably one of the least secure MFA methods recently, especially when you have the push notifications, the password list, the FIDO keys, cert-based, Windows Hello for Business, all of those other authentication methods. Go in and fine-tune what users can and can't do when it comes to authentication methods. Identity governance, access reviews, regularly reviewing who has access to which groups, to which teams. Identity governance is another P2 level feature within Entra ID, but I see a lot of companies, again, whether you use the identity governance aspect or not, or you turn this into a manual process, maybe with PowerShell scripts, is I just went into a tenant. They have like 550 guests in their Entra ID. Maybe they're valid, maybe they're not. Nobody really knows because they're not doing access reviews of who has access to which groups, who has access to which data. And while not necessarily a part of identity governance, as Copilot becomes more and more prevalent, knowing who has access to which data becomes more and more critical. Copilot's not going to introduce security vulnerabilities, but it does help people find content that they have access to faster. So if you're not regularly reviewing who has access to which data, this is going to be another one of those best practices is go in and do those access reviews. Lifecycle management, start onboarding and that automated onboarding and offboarding of users. Keeping an eye on some of that. And then global secure access. This is a new one. I think the last time I talked about global secure access on one of these sessions, it was still in private preview. This has made it out of private preview. It is now in preview, and you can go turn this on. I've enabled this in my tenant to test it out, play around with it. There's a lot of cool things with global secure access. You can now do Microsoft Entra Internet Access, where you're actually routing device traffic through a secure web gateway, and not just traffic to Microsoft 365, but all internet traffic. It sets up like a private VPN through global secure access on your various devices. Any traffic, websites, Microsoft 365, public-facing websites that are visited on that device get routed through here for monitoring, for analyzing, for helping to secure it. This actually can help with that issue we talked about earlier too, with people stealing tokens and replicating your session. This helps prevent against that because of how that traffic is now routing straight from your device to Microsoft 365 through this global secure access in a secure way. You can also go in and start doing conditional access policies where you have per app access based on some of these conditional access policies and tying this into web application proxy, if you've ever used that, for accessing on-premises applications. You can now use global secure access to route that traffic to on-premises applications via a global secure access. There's a ton of stuff that you can do with this. Again, it's still in preview. It's starting to roll out. But this is another one of those that if you do have corporate devices and you want some enhanced logging of web traffic of your users or enhanced traffic to Microsoft 365, this is one of those things that you should absolutely go look at. And I do see a question in the chat there from Lee about, can Microsoft Access or the Global Secure Access help replace an existing VPN? To a certain extent, Lee, I would say absolutely. I'm not going to as much as I would love to say, yeah, you can go replace your VPN with this and you'll never need your VPN, without knowing everything that that VPN is used for, I will say possibly it could. There's certain things that have to be in place. Like you're not going to be able, I don't believe you could go set up global secure access to like do a mapping to an SMB file share. I don't think you could quite publish that type of thing all the way through global secure access. But certain things, if they're accessing certain web applications, if you're trying to route them through VPN for some of that, really knowing what endpoint they're going through. They route through VPN, so you know they're connected to your office. And you're like using conditional access for your public IP addresses. That type of thing you could take advantage of it for over VPN. International connections from other countries, they can use Teams. Thinking through the scenario, Lee, I think you could probably go in and do that, where now you give them this agent, they essentially install it on their device, and it creates that that secured connection from their device to your environment. And then you could still set up like different conditional access policies so that any other connection from that country is blocked unless they're going through global secure access. So something like that. Yeah, these are absolutely at that enterprise level, Brian. A lot of these are not going to be small business. Some of the other ones I'll get to will be some of the business plans, particularly business premium. But a lot of these are going to be enterprise level. You could also go in and there's ways to get some of the enterprise functionality with business premium by like going in and buying a Entra ID plan 2 or something, Brian. So I agree. There's a great resource. I don't have it in my slides. Let me go post this link out. I'll put it in the chat. Maybe Victoria or someone can post it out there. It's M365maps.com. If you haven't seen it, great resource for your scenario, Brian, where you're comparing between SMB and enterprise. This is put out by an employee at Microsoft, where you can do all kinds of comparisons at that website between the different SKUs and what you have access to. Managing Microsoft 365 Graph. This one has gotten interesting. One, absolutely go learn about Microsoft Graph. Leverage the Graph Explorer. The Graph is becoming that central place to connect to all of your data in Microsoft 365. So this is something you absolutely should go in, start understanding, whether it's from you want to know kind of what developers might have access to if they're developing third-party applications for your tenant. But as an admin, if you're going in and writing PowerShell, there is a couple links on the slides. Again, you can go download the files. I think it's on the right-hand side of your screen to go get this. But even more so now, you got to start learning Microsoft Graph PowerShell. The Azure AD PowerShell module, so AAD, or Azure AD and Azure AD Preview, I think were the module names, have both been deprecated as of about 7 days ago, as well as the Microsoft Online PowerShell got deprecated. So right now, they're still available. You can still use them. They're not going to be updated. There's not going to be any more features that are added to either of those. Microsoft Graph PowerShell is the way you're going to go write your PowerShell now. So go learn it. If you have scripts written using Azure AD and Microsoft Online, I would start rewriting them so you don't get caught off guard when one of them stop working. But then you can leverage Microsoft Graph PowerShell with Azure Automation, with Power Automate, with Logic Apps. When it comes to writing scripts and automating different tasks with Microsoft 365, we read a lot of PowerShell scripts. Whether it's looping through all of our users in Azure AD, Entra ID, whether it's looping through all the users in Entra ID to make updates to those users. I've done some provisioning stuff with Microsoft Graph PowerShell, leveraging it in all kinds of different ways when it comes to managing Microsoft 365. If you're in that boat where you're going in and having to convert from one to the other, if you go look at the Microsoft Graph overview link there under PowerShell, they do have a great map there of what was the old PowerShell command in Azure AD, or what was the old command in Microsoft Online, and then going in and what is the new command when it comes to Microsoft Graph and writing the PowerShell for Microsoft Graph. So again, go understand the graph, go start converting your PowerShell scripts, learn that scripting language for Microsoft 365. Is there another added cost for global secure access? I just saw that, Rick. I can't remember off the top of my head. It might be, there might be another license for that. No, I think it's included in E5s maybe. I was just trying to look really quick a minute, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time looking. Somebody else knows and answers the question or wants to look it up, you can. I can't remember. It may actually be included in E5, or while it's in preview, this one may still be free too. They haven't come out with pricing on it. I don't know off the top of my head. I should have looked that one up around the cost or licensing for it. Another tip, managing security. This is a big one. We've seen all the hacks. AT&T had a big one the other day. Microsoft had one, I think, back in January. We feel like in the news every day, someone else has been hacked, other credentials have been leaked. Make sure you're managing your security in Microsoft 365. When it comes to Microsoft 365, it's a shared security mod, shared responsibility. When it comes to security, when it comes to, it's not on the slide, but backup and restore, another topic, another day. Yes, Microsoft is doing a lot for security. You can see some of the stats on this slide. They block 4,000 identity authentication threats per second. I think that was in 2023. And there's a link. This came from that Digital Defense Report link down at the bottom of the slide. It's a bunch of fascinating stuff in there. 65 trillion signals synthesized. They're watching IP addresses, threat actors, where these authentication threats are happening. They have 135 million managed devices that are providing security threat landscape insights into the Microsoft security platform. Microsoft does a lot for security. I was talking to someone that does some security penetration testing the other day, and Microsoft has gotten good at this. As part of his job, he writes viruses for trying to bypass people's security so he can test them out. He said Defender is actually one of the hardest ones to write a virus to get around. It takes him about a week to write a virus to bypass Microsoft Defender. A lot of the other well-known ones, I'm not going to mention any of them specifically today, are like hours, 1 hour, 3 hours to bypass some of those. And he said when he does write one that gets around Defender, because of those 135 managed devices and all these signals that are getting fed back into Defender all the time, usually he has one shot. Uses the virus, gets around Defender once, he can never use it again. Because Microsoft has caught it, propagated it out to all the other devices, integrated into the security center. Microsoft does a good job, but there's also a lot you need to do, depending on what you want to protect. Microsoft Defender XDR used to be Security Center, used to be Defender, has several different subproducts under it. So if you are wanting to manage your endpoints, go in and make sure that you're licensing Microsoft Defender XDR for endpoint, that's configured properly. Microsoft Defender for endpoint, when it comes to XDR, is going to be doing a lot of the endpoint detection, security analytics. It's sending those signals from Windows 10 or from iOS or from Mac OS up into Microsoft 365. So it is doing security analysis on there. It's tying in some of the threat intelligence that Microsoft has learned to go in and prevent some of those viruses from getting around your devices and protecting those devices from malware, from viruses that may be on there. If you're using Office 365, you're taking advantage of SharePoint and Teams and Exchange. Exchange Online protection, EOP, is included for free with every plan. You also have Defender for Office 365, where you can get into Plan 1 and Plan 2. So again, while Microsoft does a lot, depending on what you need from your security perspective, it is on you to go in and make sure you have the right licenses for security, make sure you're turning these things on. If you want to start doing some of the advanced anti-phishing, you want to do scanning of, of links and attachments that come in via your email and get some real-time reports. You can go in and Defender Plan 1 for Office 365 is going to do some of those things where it's scanning links that are coming into your email, making sure that links are safe before they even land in a user's mailbox, or routing those links that people click on an email through their filters to make sure that this link isn't going to take you to a known malicious website. Plan 2 starts incorporating some of those features around attack simulation. So how are you going in and helping your users learn? Attack simulation isn't just going in and making sure your users are behaving themselves, but it's giving them scenarios that they can learn from, helping them learn to recognize some of those suspicious attacks. So whether it's using that attack simulation in Microsoft 365 or some of the other third parties, going in and doing those regular attack simulations against Microsoft 365. If you do have Plan 2, are you going in and looking at your alerts and your incidents that are logged within Microsoft 365? Are you going into Office 365 and enabling those various alerts so that you get notified if someone is performing a certain activity or if an incident or alert is detected within your environment? So going in and, again, just making sure some of these things are turned on and configured. That's the biggest thing that I've seen when it comes to Microsoft 365 is people will go in and they'll buy it. They'll want Exchange Online, and they'll want to go put all their files in SharePoint, and they go use Teams for meetings and for chat conversations and for collaborating. But they don't think through, what are all these other things? Am I actively paying attention to what links they're clicking on through Exchange Online? Am I leveraging even the free Exchange Online protection to refine those policies? And if you are going out and purchasing a product like Microsoft 365 E3 or E5, what of these features and functionality that you have around security are you not taking advantage of because you just don't take the time to go turn them on to configure them properly? A couple other ones, if you're in a hybrid environment, you can leverage Microsoft Defender for Identity. Cloud Apps is an E5 one that can help with looking at the shadow IT. Defender for Cloud Apps actually goes out and looks for other cloud-based services, other SaaS services that users are connected to. If you especially tie this in with some of that global secure access we talked about earlier, where it's able to watch all of the different traffic coming from your users' endpoints, and when you want them using SharePoint for compliance reasons or for security reasons, are you monitoring in Defender for Cloud Apps for them going out and putting files in Dropbox or Google Drive? You can even get to the extent where you start implementing DLP policies and data loss prevention not just for SharePoint, Microsoft 360, or Microsoft Teams Exchange, but also for these third-party apps through Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. Vulnerability management, I think this one's somewhat new. This is just going to do continuous asset discovery and monitoring of all your devices. What devices are connecting to Microsoft 365? This ties into Microsoft, or this ties into conditional access of, if you're not locking down which devices could connect, are you at least watching for what devices and what assets are connecting to your organization? Or are there devices that are getting plugged into your network? This is going to be another one of those that helps a little bit more from the device perspective. This will also watch for software on devices. Which devices do you have that you have software installed on that it's not being updated, or that there's a known vulnerability in certain software that employees have installed on their devices, or that you've installed on their devices, and for whatever reason it doesn't get patched? This vulnerability management is always watching not just discovered vulnerabilities that Microsoft is collecting, but comparing that to your devices so that you know when you have a device that may be vulnerable that you need to go work on. Defender for XDR, I see a couple of questions there. Defender XDR might actually still be under security in the admin center. Defender for XDR is the new name for what used to be Security Center. So if you go to security.microsoft.com, that's also going to be Defender for XDR. There's a little bit of rebranding there going on. So to your point, Mario asked the question, what licenses include Defender for XDR? All the licenses are going to have it to some extent. What level you're going to get, like Cloud Apps, is E5. Identity, I think, is also E5. Office 365 is included in all of them. And then you can ramp up the functionality as you go from Plan 1 to Plan 2. Defender for Endpoint, I think, starts at like the E3 level for that one. Also, when it comes to security, is the secure score. This is another part that's in Defender, in the Security Center, is what are things that you can do to go in and improve your security posture? Whether this is setting different policies on your devices, configuring MFA within Microsoft 365, your secure score is going to give you all of that information. And going in and reviewing that on a regular basis. Set yourself a task for weekly or bi-monthly to go in, look at the secure score. What can I do? What's popped up on here? It changes. Vulnerabilities change, patching changes, users and devices in your organization change. That secure score will change on a daily basis based on several different factors. So going in and reviewing that regularly is going to help you manage where those vulnerabilities are and how to resolve them. I mentioned attack simulation. Incidents and hunting, this is another interesting one. You do have a certain level of hunting within Microsoft 365. They're pulling even more in. So I just did this the other day in my environment, and I'll be honest, I can't remember what stuff I'm running previews of, but you can start, if you're using Sentinel for your SIM, Microsoft Sentinel in Azure, you can actually connect your Sentinel now to Microsoft 365 Security Center Defender, so that when you go into your advanced hunting and you go start looking at incidents that are surfaced within Microsoft 365, it's pulling in all your tables in Sentinel to be able to query Sentinel right from Microsoft 365, as well as synchronize incidents that are detected in Sentinel into Microsoft 365 Security Center or Defender or whatever label you want to give it as they rename it, to be able to manage those incidents there as well. So yeah, lots of stuff here. Spend time in the Security Center. This is one that, especially in the last month to 3 months, I feel has changed a ton. And they're continuing to add features in here to help you protect and defend your Microsoft 365 ecosystem from attack. So if you're not in here regularly looking at the changes, looking at what you can do, absolutely go in and pay attention to the Security Center. Compliance and purview. We talked about security, keeping people out, whether it's conditional access policies or detecting for threats or managing your vulnerabilities. But if people are in, whether it's people inside your organization or people that are coming from the outside, manage to breach your defenses and want to try to exfiltrate data. Purview is all about managing your data, whether it's preventing data leakage and exfiltration, whether intentionally or unintentionally, auditing all your different activities. You can audit, and they actually put this in Security Center now, auditing 378 plus different Microsoft 365 activities. Everything from moving files in SharePoint to deleting emails to adding users in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. If you want to know who's performing what activities, from which devices, from which IP addresses, making sure you're familiar with this audit log and what you can go look at within this audit log. I was on a phone with a client the other day where we were digging through the audit log because they actually wanted to monitor, like if a potential breach happens, they wanted to know how can we go in and see which emails were sent from which email boxes, or can we go look at an email box and see all the emails that were sent from a particular mailbox? All of that type of stuff is in that audit log. Talk about it from security. I've also used this from just a pure management perspective. User calls up and says, I'm in SharePoint. I know this file was in this SharePoint site a week ago. I don't see it. What happened to it? I've used the audit log and I actually found it wasn't deleted, nothing malicious. Someone else accidentally moved it to a different SharePoint site. So using that audit log to troubleshoot, to look for security, all of that. Again, DLP, monitoring sensitive information, looking for sensitive information, making sure you're adhering to any data retention regulations you have. Data leakage one, like this is another one, in my opinion, not enough people set up these DLP policies. Got into organizations, they lock it down. They make it next to impossible to get in. But once I'm able to get in, I'm able to go like browse their entire file share, take all their files, dump them up into a SharePoint site or to a OneDrive location, go to any computer I want to and download all of them. Like if you turn on DLP policies, if that perimeter is breached and people are able to get in, now you're also helping to protect from them taking that data and pushing it out to a bunch of other locations. So make sure you're also looking at purview. Again, from a terminology perspective, this is compliance.microsoft.com. I think in the admin center, it may still show compliance there. Endpoints is another one. Manage your endpoints. Take advantage of Microsoft Intune. And Victoria just told me I have 15 minutes left. I am going to run out of time. Hit the highlights. If you have a bunch of devices, especially if you're going to go through the effort of doing conditional access, go ahead and enroll these devices in Intune. This helps from a conditional access perspective. Is the audit? Yeah. Sorry, I just saw a question. Going in and enrolling all your devices allows you to do remote wipes on them, to do remote resets on them. When you go set up conditional access, you can lock it down to just trusted devices that are enrolled in Intune, ones that are joined to your environment, ones that are meeting all of your compliance policies that you set up in Intune. I've been doing this a lot. I've seen a lot of companies recently that are really looking to onboard all their devices into Intune. One I'm working on right now, we're enrolling 5,000 devices in Microsoft Intune. So we can manage all their applications. We can do remote resets on them. These 5,000 users are not all in the same spot. And they want to be able to remotely manage all of these different endpoints across their organization, no matter where they are or where these users are. As long as they have an internet connection, they can go in and perform those management activities. You can manage apps in Intune, whether this is deploying applications, pushing apps out, pushing app updates out, or putting app protection policies in place so that you're able to control your corporate data on personal applications. I use app protection policies all the time, especially for things like email. People really don't like carrying two phones around, and why make them if you can work around it? So app protection policies say, yeah, go ahead, use your personal device. We're going to force you to use Outlook on your personal device, but use your personal device, use Outlook, connect your corporate email to it. But when you go access your corporate email, we're going to require you to enter a PIN in Outlook. You can put your personal email in Outlook, but corporate email, you can put that too. But every time you jump into corporate, you need a PIN. You leave the company, we're going to actually remove. We're not going to lock your device. We're not going to touch your personal email. We're just going to go in and remove our corporate data from your personal device. We're just going to remove corporate email from Outlook on your device. I saw a couple quick questions. 378 activities. It does depend a little bit on, there are certain activities that you get with a premium SKU of Purview, but for free, you get most activities under that audit log. I don't know exactly what the differentiation is. I was looking for one like a table the other day, but I didn't see like a breakdown of what activities are in which SKU. Most of those, though, you get with just about any Microsoft 365 license, Mario. Alex, Linux, Ubuntu 2204 or later, or I'm not a Linux guy, or the GNOME graphical desktop interface environment. So it's really Ubuntu is the big one there. Endpoint security, you can go in and turn on things like antivirus, disk encryption, firewall. I kind of think of Intune as these three pillars: managing your devices, managing applications on your devices, mobile, Mac OS, Windows, and then setting up security on your devices, disk encryption, antivirus, firewall. You can now do laps with Entra within your environment as well. Go look, we've talked a lot about features and functionality. Another big thing with devices or with managing Microsoft 365 is going in. Oh, come on, go to my reporting slide. Reporting. Okay, what I see might not be matching what you see. Hopefully you're seeing the reporting slide right now. Okay, good. I will go with this. Yep, managing reports. Reports are scattered all over Microsoft 365. We've talked about go and turn on these features and have these features and enable these features. Most of this reporting is within Microsoft 365 itself, but knowing where these reports are. So if you want to go look at usage, or you want to go look at reporting around spam, or you want to go look at your mail flow reports and how email is flowing. You want to go look at different reports around SharePoint and Teams. Be familiar with what these reports are. So when somebody asks you a question about sensitive information in your environment, or which of my devices are compliant with my compliance policies that I set up, how many incoming phishing attempts am I getting in a period of time? All those reports are scattered around. There's also some really good Power BI apps that you can go get around Intune and Azure sign-ins, usage of your environment and compliance. So go in and explore these reports and what's available to you. There's a lot of functionality you can pull from there. Look at my time. Questions. Keep throwing questions out there too. And if I will keep going over slides. How's this? I'm going to keep going over slides as long as I can, unless I start seeing a bunch of questions come in the chat, because I am keeping an eye on it. Let's go into self-help diagnostics, because this is one that it's kind of a little hidden feature in Microsoft 365 is some of these self-help diagnostics. This one has, it's in the Help and Support Center, and it's one of those where you can go in here and look for certain things without actually opening a support ticket. So the one here I showed, like the diag increase, and you want to go increase your Exchange Web Service throttling policy because you're doing an email migration, or you want to go increase the mailbox size, increase the size of an archive mailbox. This diag increase will actually like go through the process and do some of these actions for you within your environment. There's another one there, like guest users unable to access a file in Teams. It will actually go run like troubleshooting diagnostics for you against Teams. And it'll run some of those backend tests about if this guest is coming, almost like a what if in conditional access, if you've ever used that. If this particular guest account is coming from this particular location and they can't access this file in Teams, it'll go in and look and be like, well, they don't have permission to it, or there's a conditional access policy that's blocking it. So you can run some of those diagnostics against your environment from this self-help diagnostic option within your support center. And the trick is, with a lot of these, is actually knowing what they are. So again, you can go download the slides. On this slide, I have a link for all the different self-help diagnostics across OneDrive and SharePoint, Exchange and Outlook, and Microsoft Teams. So go out and look at these links, pull those up, and look at some of those self-help diagnostics. I think like Exchange and Outlook has one for calendar sharing as well. You can't see somebody's availability on their calendar. Somebody's having issues connecting their Outlook to Exchange Online. You can go run these different diagnostic tools within the support center to help you troubleshoot where those different, where an issue may lie, or what's going on within someone's environment. So again, super helpful. Microsoft just doesn't talk about it that much. So when you're managing Microsoft 365, being familiar with this and using this can really help out. Okay, so one more. I couldn't resist throwing something in here about Copilot because everybody needs more Copilot lately, right? Copilot, there's a couple things here. If you are looking to deploy Copilot, one of the big things that I hear, and I referenced it earlier, is that I'm worried about what people are going to be able to find. SharePoint Advanced Management, and yes, you're probably tired of this, it is another license because Microsoft. But this can really help you not just prepare for Copilot cleanup, but Microsoft has added a lot of tools in advanced management to help prevent oversharing. We talked about this earlier, even with going in and doing like access reviews. Instead of access reviews, this is going out and looking at like, how many anonymous sharing links do I have within my environment? Or setting up different policies around sharing links to help identify and prevent where content is shared with everybody. This is content in my organization that's shared with the entire organization, so they can see it. Nice tool. Copilot for Security just GA'd, not GA'd. Did it GA? Now I'm forgetting if it's GA or public preview right now. Either way, you can go use Copilot for Security as of April 1. This ties into Intune. To me, this is actually one of the most beneficial Copilot for Security. Thanks, Chris. I just saw it was GA. I had a momentary lapse in memory there. I went and turned this on in my environment. The pricing is interesting. I've seen different things on how this is going to fall. I turned it on in my environment to see how it and what the pricing ends up being. So if you're curious, like a week or 2 weeks from now on how much it cost me, feel free to shoot me a message on LinkedIn, shoot me an email, look me up I mentioned this before, just search for Ben Stedjink online and you'll find my website, my company's website, Twitter. Send me a message somewhere and I can fill you in on pricing. This to me is actually one of the most beneficial things of Copilot because it allows me to use natural language to query my Sentinel logs, to go in and ask about incidents and how they might be related together, to pull device information. There's a lot of different hooks into various aspects of Microsoft 365 with Security Copilot. There's a lot of potential here and a lot of benefit to Copilot for security already. So if you're in an organization, security is a big deal, or you just like going and playing with new Copilot tools, Copilot for security is pretty cool. And then finally, I'll just touch on this last slide, a bunch of resources. You're managing Microsoft 365, it's always changing. Stay up to date with what's going on. Review the Message Center regularly. Go browse through the roadmap. I put that RSS feed on this slide, that feeds.feedburner.office. The website is nothing, but it gives you a great summary of changes to the roadmap in your RSS feeder. I browse through anything that changed on the roadmap, like on a daily, every other day basis. A couple blogs on there, social media, podcasts, YouTube blogs. But you're managing Microsoft 365 with all the changes. Stay up to date on what's going on in Microsoft 365. So I don't see any questions. I think we have like 2 minutes left. So with that.
Oh, we're all set then.
Thanks.
We had a big active audience. That was great. And you actually answered all their questions in line. So thanks for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Well, thank
Everyone
you.
else? Okay. Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for the second session of the day. Best practices for securing and recovering Microsoft 365. So grab a second cup of coffee and take this chance to check out those resources on their console provided by CoreView and Commvault, and we'll be right back.
welcome back to our second session, everyone. Chris, please take it away.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, our sponsors, CoreView and Commvault, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor at redmondmag.com, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Managing and Securing Microsoft 365 Like an Expert Summit, called Best Practices for Securing and Recovering Microsoft 365. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey. Brian Posey is a freelance technology author and a 21-time Microsoft MVP. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column on redmondmag.com. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. You know, I didn't really get to hear the previous presentation, but I'm sure it was phenomenal. But I did tune in right at the very end when the presenter was talking about Security Copilot. And I'll just tell you, I haven't had a chance to try out Security Copilot myself yet, but over about the past 2 weeks, I have spent a lot of time with GitHub Copilot. And it's got a couple of quirks that I'm still getting used to, but overall it's phenomenal. It's definitely something I would recommend checking out if you do a lot of development or if you write a lot of PowerShell scripts. At any rate, let's go ahead and get into it. And I'm going to do something kind of unusual here and right off the bat skip ahead about 7 slides because my very first slide ended up in the wrong spot for some reason. So today we're going to be talking all about security and recoverability as it relates to Microsoft 365. Now, it might seem like kind of a weird thing to talk about security and recovery in the same presentation, but really, if you stop and think about it, the two go hand in hand. They're a natural fit for one another because at the risk of oversimplifying things, security is all about keeping bad things from happening to your data. At the same time, recoverability is all about getting your data back if something bad does happen. So security and recoverability are a natural fit for one another. Now, obviously, security is a huge topic. There's a million different directions we could go with that. Recoverability is also a big topic. So I'm going to be focusing primarily on backup and recovery, but I'm also going to interweave security, particularly as it relates to the disaster recovery process. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. Now, I think we kind of have to begin by talking about Microsoft's shared responsibility model. And the shared responsibility model, I'm sure most people are probably familiar with it by now, but just for the benefit of anybody who might not be, it's a model that nearly all cloud providers have that outlines the cloud provider's responsibility and the customer's responsibility. And Microsoft has one of these for Microsoft 365. So if you take a look at the chart right here, it outlines Microsoft's responsibilities in blue and the customer's responsibilities in gray. Now, there's a lot of information here. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I've got a lot of material to get to. But the thing that I find interesting about this is if you look at the Your Responsibilities section, it points to both security and data protection, which is the topic of this presentation. If you look at the big gray box right next to your responsibility, it says your Microsoft 365 data, access and control of your data residing in Microsoft 365. Then if you go over to the security column, I know it's a little bit difficult to read, especially if you're on a small screen. But from there, it breaks down data level responsibilities into 2 categories, internal and external. For internal, we have things like accidental deletion, malicious insiders, employee retaliation, evidence tampering. And then for external, we have things like ransomware, malware, hackers, and rogue apps. So all the things that we have to protect against. So I don't want to delve into each one of those in the interest of time, but I'll just pick one. If you look at the list of external risks, the very first one on the list is ransomware. So ransomware is certainly a security problem. Obviously, you want to do anything that you possibly can to protect against ransomware, but at the same time, it's also something that you have to think about with regard to recoverability. Because if your defenses fail and a ransomware attack does succeed, you have to think about how best to get your data back. And obviously, being able to restore a backup is your number one way of getting your data back, because you really don't want to pay that ransom if you can keep from it. Paying the ransom absolutely does not guarantee that you're going to get your data back. There are countless stories out there of people who have paid the ransom and gotten some but not all of their data back, or gotten no data back, And there are even stories of people who have gotten all of their data back, but then an hour later, the ransomware attack re-engages and they lose everything all over again. Because at that time, or at that point, the criminals know that you're financially invested in getting your data back, and so there's really nothing stopping them from asking for more money. But at any rate, there's a number of different lessons that are to be learned from all of this. The first one is that based on that shared responsibility model that I showed you, Microsoft doesn't back up your data except for its own purposes, possibly. If you were to suffer a data loss event, you can't pick up the phone, call Microsoft, and ask them to restore your data. It just really doesn't work that way. Now, I have heard rumors from Microsoft insiders that the company does back up your data for its own purposes. If they were to suffer a massive failure in one of their data centers, then they have a way of recovering it. I honestly don't know if that's true or not. It is something that I've heard, but not from official sources. So take that as you will. The next lesson to be learned is that the native Microsoft 365 data recovery mechanisms exist as a convenience feature and not as a backup substitute. So what am I talking about here? Well, with all of the various Microsoft 365 applications, a lot of them have mechanisms that are built in that will allow you to recover data that has been accidentally deleted. For example, if you accidentally delete an Exchange email, there's a way of getting that back from the deleted items folder. Likewise, there's a recycle bin for OneDrive and for Azure Active Directory, or Enter-ID as it's come to be known. And there are other mechanisms. So Microsoft does provide a way of recovering from accidental deletions. But there are any number of different situations that could cause those mechanisms to not be able to get back exactly what you need. Particularly if you end up having a situation where somebody is sabotaging your organization and they know how to permanently delete the data, thereby completely mitigating these recovery mechanisms. And there are some other situations that would cause those to be absolutely useless. So the point that I'm making is that those convenience mechanisms are there for just that, convenience. A lot of times it's quicker and easier to use those than to go in and restore a backup, but you shouldn't use those as a backup substitute because they don't offer the same level of protection as a backup. The next lesson to be learned, even though creating backups is a critical first step, there's a big difference between backing up Microsoft 365 and doing it well. And that's where best practices come into play, and that's really what this presentation is all about. You know, obviously the first step is just getting that backup software or backup service and getting a backup. That's super important. But once you've done that, it's a lot more important to begin looking at the various best practices and deciding how best to do your backups based on those best practices. Because adherence to best practices is really what's going to make the difference between being able to recover some data and nearly all of your data. The degree to which you've adhered to best practices directly translates into recoverability in a bad situation. And I'll actually take this moment to mention that as I go throughout this presentation, what you may end up noticing is that some of the best practices are counterintuitive and some are almost completely contradictory to each other. And I think that there are a couple of different reasons for that. One reason I think is that Microsoft is a huge company and different departments have their own best practices based on whatever it is that they specifically oversee. That's certainly one possibility. And another possibility is that you have to do what's right for your own business. And sometimes one best practice makes more sense, sometimes a different best practice makes more sense. So it's really important to do what's right for your own organization. And then the last lesson to be learned on this slide is that, or I guess it's not really a lesson, I'm going to be talking about all kinds of different important considerations, but as I do, I'm not endorsing any specific vendor or product or service or anything like that. So let's get into some best practices. One of the best practices is to make sure that your backup software is designed for Microsoft 365. And at this point, almost all of them are, but it's still something important just to kind of check the box and make sure. So why is this important? Well, Microsoft provides an API, and this API is what allows third-party software to see into the Microsoft 365 ecosystem and to make backups. And incidentally, this is also the same API that's used by Copilot for Microsoft 365, which is something I'm going to be talking a little bit more about in a few minutes. Because as weird as it sounds, adoption of Copilot actually affects your backup strategy. I'm completely serious. It doesn't seem like it would, but there actually are backup implications. So I'm going to be spending several minutes talking about that later on. But anyway, make sure that your backup software is specifically designed to take advantage of that API, because without the API, there are ways of backing up Microsoft 365 at a file level, but you'll find that recovery is difficult. You're not going to be able to recover, for example, a SharePoint site. You'll have to recover individual items. And the same kind of goes for Teams and some of the other applications. Also, make sure that your backup application is current, because Microsoft 365 evolves over time. We've all seen it. Microsoft adds new features to the various products. Sometimes they even introduce a new application within Microsoft 365. And from a backup standpoint, one of the evolutionary items that really sticks out in my mind is that up until about, I'm wanting to say it was 2020, Microsoft didn't have a backup API for Teams. And so you had to back up the individual Teams elements manually. And then eventually Microsoft did create that API, but it took a while for the backup vendors to catch on and to start using that API. So that's what I'm saying that's what I mean when I say that you need to make sure that your backup software is current with regard to its support for Microsoft 365. And then the last best practice on this slide is to make sure that your backup application supports hybrid Office deployments and hybrid Active Directory. That's super important. So why is that so important? Well, there are any number of different reasons. First of all, if you've got on-premises Microsoft Office servers, you don't want to have to back those up separately. It'd be nice to be able to back up all things Office-related with a single backup. So I'm talking about situations where you've got an on-premises Exchange server, but you also use Microsoft 365. It'd be great to just be able to back it all up together. Another reason why hybrid support is so important is because Microsoft 365 is completely dependent on Entra ID, which used to be known as Azure AD. So even if you don't have any on-premises Office servers, you may still have an on-premises Active Directory environment. And typically that Active Directory environment is going to be synchronized to Azure Active Directory, or Entra ID as it's now called. So if you're backing up the Entra ID environment, which is part of Microsoft 365, but you're not backing up your on-premises Active Directory, or you're backing up on-premises Active Directory but not Entra ID, and you have to do a restoration, there are ways that can work. I'll say that up front. There are ways it can work. But if you're not careful, you can end up with a data consistency problem. So it's best to just make sure that whatever backup software you're using does have that hybrid support. Another reason why you need hybrid support is because of data portability. This is particularly true if you've got on-premises Office servers. So let's say for a moment that you're using Microsoft 365, but you've also got an on-premises Exchange box. And you've got some people who have mailboxes on that on-premises system. And one day you have problems with Exchange. Well, in a situation like that, depending on the severity of the problems, it might be advantageous to just go ahead and restore those users' mailboxes up to Microsoft 365, thereby giving you time to fix the problem with your local Exchange server. And then you can always migrate those mailboxes back later on should you decide to do so. But having that flexibility is really key to keeping your users online and happy and all that. So you want to make sure that you've got that data portability. So one of the points that I've made throughout this presentation is that it's really important to consider how your data protection needs are evolving as a result of changing technology. And I already pointed out one example of that when I talked about the API that was introduced for Microsoft Teams and the need for adopting a backup application that includes that Teams API rather than relying on the old API. Well, that's certainly not the only example of evolving technology, because as I mentioned, Microsoft 365 is always changing. Microsoft adds new features to the application. Sometimes they bring us a new application. They're constantly doing patch management on the back end that we never see. So Office 365, or Microsoft 365 rather, is constantly evolving. And so it's important to make sure that your data protection is also evolving at the same pace so that you're fully protected. And one of the more recent and more significant changes that Microsoft has made to Microsoft 365 is the introduction of Microsoft 365 Copilot. And as I alluded to a few moments ago, Copilot, believe it or not, can actually impact your backup strategy. Now, in a way that sounds completely counterintuitive and totally ridiculous. I get it, because let's suppose that a user sits down and they open up Word and they use Copilot to generate text within a Word document. Well, what have they done? They've created a Word document. At a fundamental level, that resulting Word document is really no different than the Word documents that they were creating long before Copilot was ever even thought of. So it doesn't seem like Copilot would do anything to affect your backup strategy. But the reason why it's so important to examine your backup strategy with regard to Copilot is because of Microsoft 365 Copilot's ability to ingest data. So yes, you can use Copilot to author Word, Excel, PowerPoint documents, but you can also use Copilot to derive business insight from your organization's existing data. It can look at multiple data sources throughout your organization, pull information together, and then present that information in a concise and meaningful way. So in computer science, there's an old saying, garbage in, garbage out, or GIGO as it's sometimes called. And the idea behind the GIGO principle is that the output that you get is only as good as the data that you feed into it. And this is especially true when it comes to Copilot. If you give Copilot bad data, then queries that are made to Copilot that reference that data are also going to be off the mark. It just kind of makes sense. Well, because of this whole GIGO principle, Microsoft makes several recommendations to organizations who are preparing to adopt Copilot. And one of those recommendations, and it may even be the very first recommendation on the list. If it's not the first, it's like the second or third, but it's definitely toward the top of the list, is to clear out what Microsoft refers to as the ROT. ROT, or ROT, is an acronym standing for redundant, outdated, or trivial data. And the reason for this is because this type of data can have adverse effects on Copilot. But the recommendation for clearing out the ROT also stands in stark contrast to some data protection strategies that have existed for a long time. So it's important to strike a balance. So in order to do that, I think it's important to understand why Microsoft asks you to clear out the ROT before you adopt Copilot. So let's just take a couple of minutes and talk about these various data types, starting with redundant. Well, from a data protection standpoint, redundancy has always been considered a good thing. Certainly it's important to have redundant copies of your backup, hence the old 3-2-1 rule, which I'll be talking about later on if I have time. But also within your organization, you may have redundant copies of a particularly important file, maybe stored in different locations or in different clouds or on different servers, so that way there's always a copy if something happens to an original. You can get to one of the redundant copies without restoring a backup. That's something a lot of organizations do, but from the standpoint of Copilot, this redundancy is considered to be a bad thing. Now, why is that? Well, in some ways, redundancy, or let me back up for a second. Copilot is really just AI and machine learning. And when it comes to AI and machine learning, in a way, redundancy can be considered a good thing because it reinforces the training. If you've got an AI engine that's analyzing your data and it runs across the same data over and over, well, that reinforces that data and it gives the AI engine confidence that that data is accurate. But where you run into problems with redundancy is if there are subtle differences between the different documents or differences between the redundant copies of the data. Because when you've got copies of data that are really, really similar to one another, but there are subtle differences, that can sometimes cause confusion for an AI engine such as Microsoft 365 Copilot. So that's why Microsoft recommends cleaning out redundant data. Now, when it comes to outdated data, that's something else that you have to weigh carefully. Because a lot of organizations, even if the data isn't super current, there's definitely a reason to have it around. There might be compliance reasons for keeping that data on hand. You might have business requirements that require you to keep so many years worth of data, even if that data is not actively being used. But outdated data can cause problems for Copilot users. So let me give you an example. I know that just about everybody on this call is in IT, but let's pretend for a moment that you work in your organization's marketing department and that you're putting together a presentation for a customer and you decide to use Copilot to do that. So you enter a query into Copilot with a product pitch for whatever it is that you're trying to sell this customer, but your network has a lot of outdated data on it. So how do you know what Copilot's going to pull? Is it going to pull all of the current data, or is it going to use last year's product line, pricing from a couple years ago, something like that? Hopefully with that example, you can get a feel for how outdated data can cause problems for Copilot. So in any organization, you have to strike a balance between what's good for Copilot versus what you have to keep for business purposes or data recovery purposes. And incidentally, there is a way to strike a balance between this. There are certain permissions that you can remove from Copilot so that users will still have access to that data, but it will keep Copilot from being able to reference it. And I hadn't really planned on talking about that. I don't remember the name of the permission off the top of my head. I believe it was like extract or copy and extract or extract and copy. It was something like that. But if you remove that one specific permission, then Copilot isn't allowed to reference that data, but your users still can. So just something to think about. As far as trivial data, the reason why that is a problem for Copilot is because trivial data is data that's more or less unimportant. Well, again, Copilot is based on machine learning and artificial intelligence. And you never know how an AI engine is going to interpret a piece of data. So if you give Copilot a document that's super unimportant, it doesn't know that that document is unimportant. It might assume that it's on par with your most sensitive business data, or it might even assume that it's more important than your most important business data. You just never know how Copilot is going to interpret it. So Microsoft does recommend removing trivial data just to keep Copilot from getting a hold of it. Now, incidentally, when I talked about removing old data, you can do this with data lifecycle policies. There's a way of doing that through Microsoft Purview. You can set up a policy so that once data has reached a certain age, it can be automatically purged. And you can separate that out based on data type. And you can set it so that data is purged based on either the date when it was created or based on the date when it was last accessed. So while we're talking about the evolution of Microsoft 365, there's something else I want to get into, and that is the need for testing your backup strategy and your recovery strategy on a regular basis. And this is one of those things that we've heard probably all our lives. I started in IT decades ago, and even back then, backup testing was one of those things that was drilled into our heads. But I think it's probably even more important now than it was back then, simply because of the evolutionary nature of Microsoft 365. Because, as I said, Microsoft is constantly making changes to the platform. And even though it might be unlikely, any one of those changes could potentially break our backup strategy. So it's important to keep testing our backup and recovery solution because you just never know when a subtle change might end up causing a problem. And if you want to be super ambitious about this, I would also recommend that you do backup testing anytime that your backup vendor, whoever that may be, introduces a new patch for their backup product, because you never know when that patch could end up causing problems with the process that you have in place. So how important is recovery testing? Well, it's something that I do in my excuse me, I got a lump in my throat for a second. It's something I do in my own organization, if that tells you anything. But when looking at the question of how important it is, I can't help but think about a place where I used to work. This was back in the early 90s. It was pre-cloud, widespread adoption of the internet. So this particular organization had to do things a little bit differently than the way that we might do it today. But this was a large insurance company, and twice a year this insurance company would take half of its IT staff and all of its backup tapes, and they would charter a jet and fly to the other side of the country to the alternate data center and restore all of those backup tapes and then do a switch over to make sure that the organization could maintain continuity of business during a disaster. And as you can imagine, this particular process cost millions of dollars to complete, and they did this twice a year. So this was a Fortune 500 company, and if they placed that kind of priority on backup testing, that they were willing to spend millions and millions of dollars to do this and suffer great inconvenience in the process, then to me that signals that, yes, that's something super important that we should probably all be doing. So that raises the question of what kind of recovery testing should we be doing? Well, the thing about disaster recovery testing is that disasters vary widely in scope. We have everything from an accidental deletion of a file or maybe even an email on up to disasters where absolutely everything gets wiped out. So it's important to be able to account for any one of those types of disasters or anything in between. In my experience, having a situation where you have to restore absolutely everything is super rare. Yes, it's important to plan for that and to have a process in place for being able to do that, but situations like that do tend to be comparatively rare. It's a lot more common to have a situation where one workload goes down or one piece of data gets wiped out, such as a SharePoint site or something like that, and needs to be restored. So with that in mind, my recommendation would be to do granular recovery testing. So in other words, test recovering all sorts of different things. Test your ability to recover an individual user account or an individual file or folder, a SharePoint site, individual messages, and things like that. Yes, you should also be testing full recovery, but I think that it's probably even more important to be doing that granular recovery testing. Another thing that I want to quickly talk about with regard to backup and recovery testing is that there's a huge difference between backup verification and backup testing. And I saw a demo quite a few years ago where somebody really brought this point home. This demo was presented on a Windows server, and what the presenter did was they took a Windows Server box and they ended up deleting one of the system files that was needed during the boot process. So the box is already up and running, Windows is loaded, and they delete a file that's only used during Windows boot. Everything else was left alone. At that point, they ran a backup, and then they did a verification on the backup. Well, the verification process only looks to see if the data that's being backed up matches the data that was backed up. So in other words, it's checking to make sure that the backup contents match what was backed up. So the verification process completed. So at that point, the person who was performing the demo ended up rebooting the server. And of course, the server didn't boot because a critical boot file was missing. So at that point, the server is down. So then he went into a restoration. So the backup, which had verified, restored, no problem. But after the restoration, the server still wouldn't boot. And the reason for that was that the backup was taken after that critical file was removed. So the backup matched what was on the server, which was already no good. So the point being that backup testing was necessary in that case because had that backup been tested, whoever was doing the testing would have realized that there was a whoever was doing the testing would have realized that a critical file was missing and that there was a problem with the backup. However, verification didn't reveal that problem. So just a quick lesson to point out the difference between backup verification and backup testing and the importance of doing actual testing as opposed to simply relying on a verification process or a report that's generated by the backup software. Another thing to consider with regard to data recovery is to make sure that you have a way of restoring only the data that was affected by a disaster. This is one of those things that's super important, and yet it's something that I almost never hear anybody talk about. So it's something that's easily overlooked. So why is it so important to do that? Well, let's take ransomware, for example. When a ransomware infection occurs, it doesn't happen instantaneously. It's not like a user clicks on a link and then bam, within half a second, everything in your organization is encrypted. It just doesn't work that way. It takes the ransomware some time to go out and encrypt all of your data. Now, typically, the ransom demand isn't displayed until everything has been encrypted. So at that point, it can seem as though encryption is instantaneous, but the encryption process is actually happening behind the scenes before that ransom demand is ever displayed, at least in most cases. So the reason why this matters is because if you have a lot of data, it can take quite a bit of time for a ransomware infection to encrypt everything. And during that time, there are going to be subtle signs that something is going wrong. If we're talking about data that's stored on local servers, for example, you'll see an increase or a spike in increased disk activity. You might also see things acting a little bit weird, users having trouble opening certain documents, things like that. Those are all signs that a ransomware attack may be underway. So a lot of times, especially with automated monitoring solutions, an organization can detect a ransomware attack in progress and shut it down before it's ever completed. So let's say that you're able to do that. Let's say that you're able to put a halt to a ransomware attack that's in progress, and some data has already been encrypted, but there's a lot of data that hasn't been encrypted. Well, at that point, it's a lot better to be able to run some kind of process and figure out what's been affected by the ransomware attack and what hasn't, rather than simply restoring everything. And there are a couple of different reasons for that. One reason is that it's going to take a lot more time to restore everything than to be selective about what you restore. And remember, we've got continuity of business to think about. So we really want to make sure that our data is available as quickly as possible rather than just spending a long time unnecessarily restoring absolutely everything. The other reason why it's so important to be able to identify what was affected and what wasn't, and restore only the affected data, is that you can end up accidentally overwriting good data with older data if you just do a blanket restore. So let's say, for example, that a ransomware attack started at, 10 a.m. and a user decides to update a file at 10:05 a.m. Now, the ransomware attack is halted before that file ever gets encrypted. So you've got some files that have been encrypted, and you've got a user who has updated a file, but that file was never overwritten. Well, if the organization goes in and just does a blanket restoration of all of the files, then that's going to revert that user's file back to their older version, meaning that the user is going to have to redo whatever it is that they did on that file. So it's better to be selective about the recovery process rather than just restoring everything, so that you're not accidentally reverting data back to a previous state unnecessarily. Another thing to consider with regard to ransomware is what can you do to protect your backups against ransomware, because there are several variants now that will seek to actively compromise your backups. Because remember, the ransomware authors know that restoring a backup represents your best chance of being able to recover from the attack without paying the ransom. And they want to get paid, so they know that their odds of getting paid go way up if they're able to take your backup out of the equation. So what can you do? Well, one thing that you can do is to consider air-gapped backups. An air-gapped backup is simply a backup to removable media that is then ejected from the system once the backup is complete. Because remember, ransomware can't infect what it can't touch. So if you've got a backup that's physically disconnected from the system, then the ransomware is not going to be able to touch that. That's what we mean by air-gapped. Also, there's immutable backups or even immutable air-gapped backups. And just to be perfectly clear, I use both of these in my own organization, but I use them as supplementary backup solutions rather than as primary backup solutions, because there's a big trade-off. Having air-gapped backups is good, but because those backups are air-gapped, you can't back up nearly as frequently as you could had the backup remained online. So in a few slides, I'll show you what that backup schedule looks like. But before I move on, I do want to point out one thing. And that's immutability. There are a couple of different ways of handling immutability. One is to do immutable versioning so that you retain every previous version of a file, and those versions are made immutable so that you always have the ability to go back to an earlier version. Those earlier versions can't be wiped out. That's a great way to protect against ransomware, because even if a file gets encrypted and that encrypted file gets backed up, you've always got a way of going back to a previous state. Those previous states can't be erased. Another way of doing immutable backups is to do what I do in my own organization, and that's just periodically to copy all of the data to immutable media. Now, that approach is really only suitable for smaller organizations, but I'm a one-man shop, so that's the way that I handle things. And in case you're wondering, immutability, if we're not talking about the cloud, if we're just talking about on-premises immutability, that's one of those things that tends to be the domain of enterprise-class environments, because immutable storage tends to be expensive. But the way that I do it, and this isn't something that's going to be practical for everybody, but I want to just throw that out there in case it's helpful to anyone. The way that I handle immutability in my own organization is to use something called an M-disk. An M-disk, for anybody who's not familiar with it, looks like a DVD, except it's made for immutable storage, and it's got a really long lifespan, because supposedly, from what I've read, if you write data to a recordable Blu-ray, that data can begin to degrade after about 7 years, whereas an M-disk has a theoretical lifespan of about 2,000 years. So it's a permanent archive, and it's something that can't be erased. It's a worm disk. You write to it once, and then it can't be written to again. So it's immutable storage that's protected for the long term. And those M-disks that I referenced have about 100 gig storage capacity. So you're not going to copy some massive database to an M disk, but if you're backing up files and folders, they do a pretty good job. So another thing that I would recommend is use an isolated backup environment. If we're talking about backing up Microsoft 365, you don't want to back up your Microsoft 365 data to Microsoft 365 because your backups would be stored in the same place as your primary data. And if something happened to your primary data, chances are your backup data that's stored in the same place would also become compromised. So you want to store the data separately from the Microsoft 365 service. I also recommend using a dedicated service account for all backup-related activities, because if somebody were to gain access to your Microsoft 365 Global Admin account, that account shouldn't give them access to your backup, because if they've gone in and done whatever it takes to get access to that Global Admin account, you can assume at that point they've got bad intentions, and you really don't want to make it possible for them to get access to your backups by using that account, because your backups may be the one thing that saves you from their bad intentions. So use a completely separate account for that. Store those backups elsewhere so that whoever gains access to that account can't touch your backups. Another recommendation would be to use role-based access control to limit access to your backups. So again, use dedicated accounts. The normal administrative accounts shouldn't have access to your backups. But likewise, the accounts that you create for backup purposes shouldn't have access to anything but the backups, and they shouldn't be used for any other purposes other than backup-related tasks. And there are organizations that will even further segment things so that specific accounts are related to specific so that certain accounts are related to specific backup-related tasks. So you might have a task or an account rather that can only do backups. You might have another account that can only do restorations or things like that. So another recommendation is to take a look at recovery point frequency. Recovery point frequency translates directly into how much data you could potentially lose during a crisis. So to put this into perspective, think about the old school backups that everybody ran way back when. Those backups generally ran late at night after everybody went home for the day. So you had one backup that ran every night. And those backups had a theoretical data loss limit of about 24 hours. Sometimes it was more, sometimes it was less, depending on how long the backup took to complete. So suppose for a moment that a backup runs from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., and then a failure happens at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, in a situation like that, that backup completed at 3 a.m., so the organization would lose all of the data that has accumulated from 3 a.m. until the failure happened at 4 p.m. The next day, meaning that the organization could potentially lose 13 hours worth of data. So the nice thing about modern backup solutions is that most of them are based on continuous data protection, meaning that recovery points are created on a super frequent basis. And the faster that we create those recovery points, the less data that we could potentially lose during a failure situation. So I mentioned earlier that I would talk a little bit more about the way that I use immutability and air-gap backups in my own organization. And I also mentioned that I recommended using those as supplementary backup solutions rather than as a primary backup solution. So in my own organization, I have a 3-tier backup that I create. My primary backups are based on continuous data protection, and those backups create recovery points every 30 seconds. So the next stage is my air-gap backup, and my air-gap backups are written to removable hard drives. So these are just 20 terabyte hard disks that stay in a disk caddy in my server room. I run a backup, and then I unplug that from the disk caddy, put it in a safe place, and then pop in a disk for the next day. And then my immutable air-gap backups that I talked about are written to M disks. So I do my normal air-gap backups to removable hard disks every 24 hours. And then my immutable backups get written generally about once a month. Sometimes it's a little sooner, sometimes it's a little later. It kind of depends on what I've been doing. For example, a few days ago I finished up my tax returns, so that's important data. I wanted to go ahead and get written to immutable backups, so I did one a little sooner than I normally would. Conversely, if I've been on vacation or something like that and haven't been creating much data, I might drag out the process a little bit longer than I otherwise would. But that's how I handle things. Now, one of the questions that sometimes comes up with regard to recovery points is, yes, super frequent recovery points can limit the amount of data that you lose, but is there such a thing as too much of a good thing? Like in my own organization, as I mentioned, I'm a one-man shop. I really don't create that much data, especially if we're comparing it to a quote-unquote real company. So why create backups every 30 seconds? Is that overkill? Well, there's a couple different ways of looking at that. One is that the backup software and the backup hardware are designed to do that, so it's really not putting any undue burden on the system. And if you have the capability, then you might as well use it. So that's one way of looking at it. But the other way of looking at it is that every once in a while, having super frequent recovery point creations can actually save you from data loss, even in the absence of a major catastrophe. A few weeks ago, for example, I had a situation where I had just wrapped up a major project. This was a project that took me several weeks to complete, and I wrapped it up, and I was cleaning up some folders, and I made a mistake, and I accidentally deleted the folder that was associated with the project. And because that folder was on a network drive, it didn't go to the Windows recycle bin. It was just permanently deleted. Well, in that particular situation, I actually used a different method to get that data back. I used Hyper-V replicas, and I wanted to find out if I was able to use a replica to get that data back, and I was actually. That was something that I wrote about recently. But had I had to rely on that backup, well, there wasn't very much time that elapsed between the project being created and that accidental deletion. So having that recovery point being created every 30 seconds, in that situation, had I had to rely on the backup, that truly would have made the difference between getting my data back or losing it forever and having to start that project all over again. So just something to think about. So another thing that I wanted to talk about, especially with regard to security and backups, is backup encryption. And this is one of those things where there are two main schools of thought regarding backup encryption. And I'm not saying that one's right and one's wrong or anything like that, just two different ways of thinking about things. One way of thinking about this is that all data should be encrypted at rest and in flight in order to preserve security and privacy and to prevent anyone from tampering with your backups. So that's one school of thought. The other school of thought is that backups should never be encrypted, because if you're using your backup to recover data, you really don't want anything standing in the way of being able to do that recovery and potentially going wrong to cause the recovery to not succeed. Now, if you're working in a regulated industry or for a large company that has lots of rules in place, you really don't have a choice here. Encryption is probably mandated, and that's the way to go. If you're independent, then you're going to have to choose between these two options. And again, I'm not saying that one's right, one's wrong, or anything like that. But there are a couple of things to think about here. One is that I have seen real-world failures caused by lost encryption keys. I've seen more than one example of an organization that was unable to restore its data when it needed to, simply because there was a problem with the encryption keys. Either the encryption keys were lost or the recovery hardware. In one case that I'm thinking of, it was a tape drive that stored the keys internally that was damaged. So I have seen recovery operations fail as a result of lost encryption keys. Now, having said that, the opposite is also true. Backup encryption is way more seamless today than it used to be. It's far more reliable than it once was. So I think the risks related to encryption are minimal as compared to what they once were, but it's still something that you might want to think about. So another thing to think about is that if you truly are doing that super frequent backup and recovery testing, then if there is a problem with your encryption keys, that's something that should be revealed through the testing process. So it's not one of those things that you're likely to find at the time of a disaster. It's one of those things that would be revealed through backup testing. And so you can catch it ahead of time and fix it before it ever becomes a true issue. So how do I handle it? Well, in my own organization, I kind of use a hybrid solution. For my primary backups, the ones that are based on continuous data protection, those are encrypted. But my air gap backups, the ones that I write to the removable hard disks and the ones that are immutable that I write to M disks, those aren't encrypted. The reason why I don't use encryption on those is, one, I work out of my house. There's like zero chance of somebody getting a hold of my backups. But the other reason is because my continuous data protection solution based backups, those are my primaries. If something goes wrong, that's what I'm going to be restoring. if I'm in a situation where I'm restoring data off of a removable hard disk or an M disk, then something has gone seriously wrong at that point, and my primary backups have been compromised. So if I'm having to resort to using an external hard disk or an M disk or something to recover my data, I don't want anything getting in the way of a successful recovery, because at that point I'm running out of options. So that's the reason why I don't encrypt those. Again, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but it is something to think about. So another consideration is monitoring and alerts. This is a trap that I've seen some organizations fall into, particularly smaller organizations, is that once a backup's been put into place and it's been proven a few times, it's easy to just assume that it's working. So it's a good idea to put a process in place, if you haven't already, to check and make sure that the backups are functioning. And this should be done at a bare minimum daily. You should also use some sort of monitoring and alerting solution to signal for failed jobs and for any type of signal that might indicate there's an attack going on. Another recommendation that I would make with regard to your backups is to develop retention policies for your backups. Now, I talked about retention policies earlier when I was talking about Copilot, and in that regard, I was talking about using retention policies as a mechanism for purging old data once it's no longer relevant to your organization. Now, when we're talking about backup retention, these are completely separate retention policies that apply only to your backups. So when you develop a retention policy for your backup, what you're essentially doing is you're making a decision about how many backups you should keep on hand or how many recovery points you want to maintain. And that's not a decision to be taken lightly. It has to be based on a number of factors, the most important of which are any regulatory requirements and what your business's requirements are. And when you're trying to figure out the business requirements, the way to do that is to just say, okay, when does a backup become so old that even if it were the only backup available, we would never ever restore that because it would be completely pointless to do so. So that's not necessarily the ideal retention period, but it should at least get the discussion started and help you to zone in on where that ideal retention period might be. It's also worth creating a retention period for air-gapped backups, because otherwise you could amass a huge collection of tapes or removable hard disks or whatever you end up using. So your retention period for air-gapped backups really becomes sort of a media rotation schedule. And with regard to air-gapped backups, make sure that you're storing at least one of those off-site at all times. So that way, if something happened to your primary facility, you don't have to worry about every backup that you own also being destroyed. Now, when it comes to off-site storage is super important, as I mentioned. You want to make sure that at least one of your air-gapped backups is off-site at all times. But you also have to be careful about the way that you handle off-site storage, because over the years, I have seen some problems caused by off-site storage. So, for example, there's always the possibility of media, whether it be a tape or removable hard drive or whatever, being lost, stolen, destroyed, something like that. You know, I can't help but think about a place that I used to work, and again, this was a long time ago. It was back in the 90s, but this organization did tape-based backups. And early on, when this organization was just a startup, their policy was that every morning the backup completed at 7 a.m., they ejected the tape, and then they gave it to a designated employee, and that employee took the backup tape home for safekeeping, and it stayed there until that backup came due for the next rotation cycle. And that seemed to work out pretty well for a while. Again, this was a small startup company, so there weren't really any regulations getting in the way or anything like that. It seemed to work out okay for a while until this employee made the mistake of leaving a tape in their car on a hot day and the tape melted. So needless to say, the company stopped doing that. What they did at that point was they decided to start using a backup courier service. So this courier company would pick up the tape at 7 o'clock in the morning when the backup completed. They would take it off site, store it in a secure vault, and then whenever that tape was scheduled to be rotated, they would bring that tape so that it could be overwritten by the next backup in the sequence. And that worked out pretty well, but there was one problem with that, and that was the inaccessibility of tapes. Because what happened was the courier service picks up tapes at 7 o'clock in the morning. Well, one day we ended up having a massive system crash, at, I don't remember, it was maybe 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, but it was several hours after the previous night's backup tape had been picked up. So what that meant was that we had no backup tape that we could restore from. So somebody had to call the courier service, and then the courier service billed us for an unscheduled delivery, and the bill wasn't cheap. And then it took them about an hour to get the tape to us, and only then could we start the restoration process. Now, today this is a little bit less relevant than it once was because we primarily use cloud-based backups or disk-based backups that are, in one place inside some massive storage appliance. But when you do start looking at air-gapped backups and needing to store at least one air-gapped backup off-site for safekeeping, you have to consider these types of issues. So you have to consider, what can I do to safeguard the media so that it's not stolen or damaged or lost or anything like that? But you also have to consider how to expedite the process of getting that media in your hands should it become necessary to do so. So with that said, I know I'm just about out of time, but I want to take a few minutes and open it up for any questions.
Yeah, let's get a couple questions in here before our next session. I've heard that Microsoft is making its own Microsoft 365 backup product. Would that be a good option for backing up any data?
Quite possibly. For anybody who might not have heard about this, Microsoft announced that they're creating a backup option for Microsoft 365. It's going to be integrated directly into the console. The main marketing benefit that Microsoft is mentioning with regard to this backup product is speed, because you're backing up Microsoft 365 data to the Azure data center. So it's a super fast connection. Backup and restore operations are going to be super fast. But that's really the main benefit that Microsoft is touting with this service, as opposed to all of the other capabilities that you get with third-party vendors. But what's really interesting is that Microsoft is providing an API to this backup service that's going to allow all of the third-party backup vendors to latch onto it. So what that means is that if you've got a third-party backup solution that you're already using and you're already happy with, then chances are if you just wait long enough, you'll probably get the capabilities that Microsoft is providing with their own native backup solution built into the software that you're already using.
Here's a great question. What are some ideas for getting my employer on board with modernizing their backups?
What can you do to get your employer on board with modernizing your backup? Okay, if your employer is using something that's really outdated, the first thing that I would do is show the financial cost of what would happen if that backup system failed. In other words, most organizations have SLAs that are in place. Show how that backup system is probably not going to be able to keep pace with that SLA, thereby causing all kinds of problems. Also show some of the capabilities that exist in some of the modern backup solutions that don't exist in legacy products, and why those new modern capabilities are so important, and what harm the business could potentially suffer by not having those types of capabilities.
Okay, great. Let's get one more question in here before our next session. What should I do if my business's needs seem to contradict a lot of the backup best practices?
I lost you for just a second, Chris. Can you say that again?
Yeah, sure. What should I do if my business's needs seem to contradict a lot of the backup best practices?
Okay, so what should you do if your business's needs contradict a lot of the best practices? Well, keep in mind, a lot of the best practices that exist out there can be contradictory to each other. So there are relatively few backup best practices that are just etched in stone and pertain to every single situation. So if you have a business need that goes against some of the backup best practices, chances are there's probably another best practice out there that goes along with what it is that you're trying to do. In my opinion, I would always put the business's needs ahead of just religiously adhering to some obscure best practice. You got to do what's right for the business.
Okay, perfect. That's all the time we have. Thanks for the great presentation, Brad.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Everyone, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our third session, Hottest Third-Party Solutions, and the giveaway of our GoPro Hero 10, which you must be present to win. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our third session, everyone. Chris, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Paoli, editor at redmondmag.com, and I'm happy to welcome you back to our third and final session of the day, Hottest Third-Party Solutions. Some quick notes before we start. We wanted to thank you for attending. Please be sure to stick around till the end, not only because you'll be eligible to win that GoPro Hero 10 in our random drawing, but also because as you leave, you'll be asked to take a short survey with your opinions of the event. Please share those honest opinions. Our editors read every comment and they shape our future events. And speaking of our future events, we really want to thank our sponsors, CoreView and Commvault. They're sponsoring this event because they believe in this community and want to support events like these. So please show your support and appreciation by downloading their resources and visiting their sites and contacting them for a future demo. It's through their underwriting of these events that we can bring more summits like this to you in the future. So thank you, CoreView and Commvault. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you, fellow moderators, and make sure you stay on for the prize drawing. With that, I'm happy to announce our first speaker with our third session, Roy Martinez, Technology Evangelist at CoreView. Take it away, Roy.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. Hopefully you can hear me okay. As Chris mentioned, my name is Roy Martinez. I'm what they call a technology evangelist here at CoreView. All that really means is that I make my living coming to sessions like this and talking about all the wonderful technology that we speak to and kind of help with at CoreView, and also kind of just talking about Microsoft 365 and the collaboration space in general. This is just a topic of true passion for me. So I'm always happy to come to these kinds of events and kind of share what I've learned throughout the years. So without further ado, today's session is going to be talking very high level about the notion of external sharing and governing of external sharing in Microsoft 365. I've titled this Enhancing Security in M365, a Guide to External Sharing Governance. This is a very, very high-level primer. I think every point that we make within today's session is something that could be drilled into very deeply. And obviously, we encourage anyone listening to get a hold of us here at CoreView if you ever want to talk more deeply about any of these topics. So let's jump right into it. And we'll set the stage by just kind of identifying what are the stakes, right? In my estimation, the stakes are actually quite high. According to a recent survey, the source isn't noted on this slide, but I do have the source for you. It's through AIM. But 58% of all sensitive data in the cloud resides today within Microsoft 365. Now, we know that Microsoft is a fairly ubiquitous player in not only the cloud space, but in general technology, business technology in general. So it's not too surprising that we have a statistic like this, but it really is noteworthy that more than half of the sensitive data that lives in the cloud lives in 365. This is talking about things like Office documents. This is talking about things like SharePoint and Teams, which are very, very closely linked. This also mentions, things like OneDrive, things like your ancillary devices or storage units within the Azure space. So there's lots of ways that we mean that, but generally speaking, my point here is there's a lot of stuff out there, and it's very sensitive and it's very critical to business. So being able to understand, manage, and govern who does and doesn't have access to it, whether external or otherwise, is highly critical and very, very important. So what are some of the challenges associated to external sharing in general? I've got a wonderful quote here from Max Goss and Chris Jackson at Gartner. Microsoft 365 provides 8 mechanisms for users to share their content with external parties, and over 50 settings across 5 administration centers to control access. Now, one way we can interpret that statement is, wow, we have a lot of really cool, flexible options at our disposal for sharing and collaborating, and that's absolutely true. But the other side of that coin is, all that flexibility comes at a very high cost. The complexity involved in the management and governance of that really, really wide net of capability is pretty important. It's easy. I'll always use Teams as my analogy, right? Remember when Teams came out, it made it so super cool and easy for end users to collaborate and share and do the stuff they need to do. But it really is kind of a nightmare on the admin side to wrangle in and kind of control all of those different pieces of that puzzle that are working together. And this topic kind of plays here as well. So yes, we have a ton of really cool flexible features to allow us to collaborate and share, but managing those is where the challenge lies. So let's look at some of the risks that are involved. So first off, we're talking about organization-wide access to very sensitive files, right? When we work with our default permission set, that 58% of sensitive data that's out in 365 is potentially just available organization-wide. Now, historically, we have this concept of security by obscurity, right? In other words, if I don't know where something lives, then I am not a threat or I'm not a security consideration because I don't know where it exists, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. But under the default model, that's kind of the way. The organization has all the sensitive data, and if you don't have a really tight grip from a security angle on who does and doesn't have access to what, external or otherwise, you're putting yourself in a position to be, how should I say, kind of at risk. So external users that get added to teams that include sensitive files, this is a big risk, right? So as I mentioned earlier, teams kind of democratize the way we do collaborative business in Microsoft 365, and it's really a game changer. And I think a lot of the things that we've seen in Microsoft 365 that have evolved over the years speak to that same evolution. But whenever you add external users to a team, and you do or do not know that team has sensitive data, you have potentially added yet another risk point to your security posture. So again, understanding where this stuff resides, understanding who does and doesn't have access to it, it gets more and more critical the more you open up the gates, so to speak, to your end user base. Anonymous access to ungoverned SharePoint sites. What's an ungoverned SharePoint site? Well, did you know, and I'm sure everyone here did, every time you create a team, you're creating a SharePoint site. Every time you create a private or shared channel, you're creating another SharePoint site. Every time you create a Microsoft 365 group, you're creating a SharePoint site. So that may seem like, of course, Roy, we know that, but all that stacks up, and the more entry points you have, if you're relying on default kind of security model and you don't have checks and balances in place to ensure that those quote-unquote ungoverned and forgotten sites don't have external access hitting them, then you can, you're adding risk to your posture. Which all of this stuff violates the core principles of least privilege. Least privilege is about you only have the privilege to specifically the assets you need to do your job and nothing more. So all these ungoverned sites, these kind of teams that have external users added, we're bending the rules, so to speak, in terms of that least privilege model, and you're putting yourself, again, at risk. And just to further elucidate the point of the sites and teams, sprawl is a term we're all familiar with, team sprawl, SharePoint sprawl. Well, yes, from a purely operational and kind of logistic perspective, team sprawl is a bummer to govern because it can do things like affect how search is effective and, just make it hard to keep track of things. But it also overwhelms our security team because, again, every one of those sites technically has its own SharePoint security layer as well as the group membership. All those teams, individual channels with shares and private channels and this and that, you're adding like layers of complexity, and the ability to share each of those independent objects independently with different external users creates a very complex web of security considerations to keep at the front of your mind as an admin. And of course, any identities that are just unapproved, that are accessing sensitive files, obviously represent the highest risk. And all of the previous bullet points speak directly to this point. If we don't have checks and balances that are approving who does and doesn't have access to these various entry points, we're, again, putting ourselves at major risk. And this doesn't even speak to what Copilot adds to the mix in the modern era, right? So I mentioned earlier this security by obscurity notion. Well, that goes right out the window with Copilot. Because now we have this amazing technology that can surface pretty much anything we need to us as end users if left unchecked. And that means also surfacing things that maybe we shouldn't be able to see or maybe we shouldn't have access to. So as an external user, if I'm given licensing to leverage Copilot, that might give me access in a famous and notable case to things like payroll information, or use your imagination to define what risky document might be bad for an external user to accidentally get access to via AI. So note to self, go through the ringer in terms of your Copilot adoption and make sure you understand what that really means. So what are some strategies that we can implement for enhancing our governance around external sharing and even just access in general? Obviously, audit and monitor external sharing constantly. I don't mean run an audit at the top of the year, forget about it till the next year starts. I mean a regular review. I want continuous understanding of who has access to what specifically, not generally, but specifically. Every single object or container that is externally shared with a user outside of your org, or even internal from department to department, we need to know that. We need to regularly monitor those things. Implement least privilege access. Again, this is about ensuring that users have only the access they need to the assets that are relevant to them. Least privilege access is one of those buzz terms that can be kind of hand-waved. Hey, we've got some policies in place, it's kind of handled, whatever, and like set and forget. To me, least privilege access, in fact, all these topics to me are not set and forget concepts. They are set and monitor over time continuously concepts, right? So least privilege access means putting in place those policies that are going to ensure that users only have what they need. This one's an interesting one, and it's kind of, you read it and you might think, well, duh, but it's alarming how often this is kind of overlooked. Educate your user base. Promote the awareness of the risks that are associated with this external sharing. If it's one thing for me to, as an admin, say, well, Joe Smith, you allowed that external user in and they got access to XYZ and you're at fault. But the reality is, who's really at fault if Joe Smith had no idea what the risk was of allowing that external user in? Now the blame changes a little bit. So again, educate your users, foster a culture of communication, make sure that you are aware of the risks that are associated with these different concepts, such as external sharing and things of that nature. Again, a little bit of a no-brainer, but leverage the security tools that you have at your disposal. There's tons of built-in tools that are ready for you to better control visibility. Things that come to mind are, obviously things like Purview, Defender, all the different fun reports that we have at our disposal. Third-party tools, tons of those available to help really get your handle around these things. So yeah, use the tools that are available when they're available. Adopt a zero-trust model. We've all heard the term. What does it really mean? Verify every access request regardless of origin. Obviously external, but not just external. So zero trust means by default, we trust nothing. In order to gain trust, you must be vetted. You must go through some sort of process, and in order to maintain trust, attestations must occur over time. Again, continuous compliance, not a set and forget. So again, I can preach on and on about these topics, but hopefully my message is coming across clear. For me, external sharing, and not just external sharing, but the whole notion of access and privilege management in general is not something to be taken lightly, and it's not something that we just talk about once and forget about. It's a continuous, it's almost a culture of organization. It's something we need to foster from the ground up and make sure everyone is part of. So what is CoreView? How do we get involved, right? So CoreView is a really cool company. I say company now because, in the old days, CoreView was a product, but now CoreView is a company that represents a couple of different platforms. Specifically, we have two major platforms that can assist in all of the things that I've talked about today. So on one side of the coin, we have Simian Cloud, our kind of configuration as code, best practices, baselining platform. And this is about building the blueprint of your Microsoft 365 tenant or footprint, the foundational scaffolding, so to speak. So all those tenant-level configurations for intra-ID, those tenant-level configurations that manage conditional access policies, your compliance and security settings, all your sensitivity label configurations at the tenant level, managed by Simian Cloud, and allows you to kind of essentially download the configurations for your tenant as a template and then maintain that as a baseline and determine when our configuration is drifting from that source baseline? Or can I apply that baseline to other tenants that I manage if we're in a multi-tenant situation, preventing you from having one-off situations wherein your dev tenant didn't have the relevant access controls in place to prevent, I don't know, Midnight Blizzard from jumping in and getting access to production from a back door. So very, very important stuff just to set the foundation. On the other side of the coin, we have CoreView Platform, or Core Suite as we call it now, which is more like managing the operations of the building now that it's built. How do the rooms, the furnishings, are the doors working? Do the locking system work? Are the occupants in the offices they're supposed to be in, and so on and so forth? This is stuff like user management, manage when users join, move, leave, manage their licenses, but in more context of what we're talking about, regularly set policies that prevent access from changing or put attestations in place to go through checks and balances when accesses need to be changed or added, and so on and so forth, be able to report on all that. So between the two platforms that we offer at CoreView, we think that we have a pretty cool recipe for allowing organizations to really get their hands around and control these very complex topics in a much, much simpler way. So I'll step down from the soapbox at this point. Let's jump into some Q&A just to see if there's any questions around anything I've discussed.
Yeah, we actually just have time for one question before our next presentation, and it's a good one. How does CoreView facilitate a zero trust model for Microsoft 365?
Brilliant. Yep, that's, by the way, that's me. I'll drone on and on if you let me. But so the cool thing about CoreView is we have this notion of playbooks, and a playbook is allowing you to run any report you want from our product, set the criteria for what that report gives me. For instance, show me all users who have gained access to resource A in the past 90 days. And then tie that report, tie that intel to some level of automation. And that automation might be revoke access. That automation might be go through attestation to ensure that Administrator A is aware of it, and so on and so forth. So you can set and create these policies, build them into playbooks, and then apply them to your systems so that you have continuous, immediate, kind of automagical compliance. So again, before we jump away, I know that I've used up a lot of time, just really quick, a couple of assets that are available from the CoreView website. We've got a wonderful 365 governance best practices guide available for download for free. An outstanding permission scanner, Microsoft 365 application permission scanner, will tell you if you meet any of the weaknesses that allow Midnight Blizzard to occur. And then obviously, if you go to our site, you can see full throwdowns of exactly what our tool does. I want to thank everyone for listening to me drone on and on. Again, it's a subject I'm very passionate about. But Chris, take it right back away, and I appreciate those patience.
Yeah, thanks for the great presentation, Ray. Let's jump right into our next presentation with Brian Bauer, Senior Software as a Service Architect at Commvault. Take it away, Brian.
All right. Thanks, everyone. My name is Brian Bauer, and like Chris said, I'm a Senior SaaS Architect here at Commvault. Today, we're going to be talking about safeguarding Microsoft 365 data from today's threats. So, when I have calls with folks, and I do that quite often in my role here at Commvault, I often hear people say, well, it's in the cloud, it's safe. Well, the truth of the matter is, just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean your data is immune to data loss or corruption. Everyone here knows that Microsoft is really transforming how our workforce gets things done, right? The awesome tools and features that are being produced for the Microsoft 365 product is really enhancing productivity, driving great efficiencies, and really facilitating the idea of remote work. Now, like I was saying before, just because your data is in the cloud, you still have to be mindful of the possibility of data loss. The typical risks that I see a lot that people talk about is when you look at how we used to have to do things on-prem or worry about site failure, fire, other natural disasters, may not be required now, but what we do now have is a new set of things that we do have to be mindful of. While there are many things that could contribute to these data loss pieces, I would really like, though, to focus on data corruption, accidental deletion, and malicious attack. So first is data corruption. Data corruption can be caused really by many things, such as integrations of software, development issues, migration failures, things like that. If data corruption happens, how do you get your data back? The second thing would be accidental deletion. I know personally, myself, when I was an administrator, I accidentally deleted stuff. We all do accidentally make mistakes, right? Things happen. If that happens, how do you get it back? The third thing I'd like to talk about is malicious attacks. Malicious attacks can be broken out into a couple things, internal and external. External attacks are those sophisticated attacks coming from the outside, especially now with AI. These attacks would include your zero-day threats, ransomware, and such. Internal attacks, though, they could be a rogue admin or somebody insidious in your organization that can do things to affect your data. And typically, these are a little bit more difficult to capture and to see what's going on. Both internal and external attacks can be quite concerning, but you don't have to worry as much as long as your data is protected. So I've talked about a few different possibilities for data loss. Let's talk a little bit now about shared responsibility models. So cloud service providers such as Microsoft follow what's known as a shared responsibility model. These models basically say what your responsibility is as a customer and what the software solution provider's responsibility is. In Microsoft 365, for example, the responsibility for them is to make sure the uptime, the application, the performance is all available, and they do a fantastic job. Now, your responsibility would be the same as it would be on-prem with your data. You need to make sure it's safe. You need to make sure it's available, right? So put plainly, Microsoft, they have the application. Your responsibility is to make sure that your data is available and that it's good. Now, why dedicated backup for Microsoft 365? So with dedicated backup, it really extends and enhances what you get out of the box with Microsoft, with really purpose-built controls that will give you advanced capabilities when it comes to how you safeguard and protect your data, as well as potentially help you recover from a threat and incident. The first of which Commvault SaaS has to offer is data isolation. Data isolation gives you the ability to really air gap your backup copies from your source data. I can't overstate how important this is. The criticality of this capability is really, really important because with what's happening in cyber attacks today, if you can make sure your data is separate from your production data, you're going to know that your data is going to be safe. If something was to happen in your production environment, whether it be external or internal threat, you want to make sure that you can recover that data. That is the most important. So this air gapping really helps you make sure that your data is safe in the face of that attack. Another thing that Commvault SaaS can help with is extended retention. This gives you the ability to have your data longer and to be able to go beyond things like recycle bin limitations and have the ability to recover active or deleted data sets that may be farther out. Commvault SaaS will also help you from a business continuity standpoint, find and recover data with speed and precision. This is really important. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Commvault Cloud and the backup and recovery product. With Commvault Cloud, we really focus on enterprise-grade performance and data protection. And we give you the full breadth of being able to protect all of the products, SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, and Teams. It's really important to make sure that you're able to protect all of those products in a robust way, to have good TCO, and to make sure that the data is always available quickly and effectively, that when you restore it, it's there. Now, what's coming? We're really excited with the new Microsoft 365 backup product that Microsoft is coming out with, and the ability of how we're going to be able to partner with them and release with a full solution to be able to get granular as well as be able to restore large amounts and blocks of data quickly and effectively. Really what we're doing is we're going to be able to work with this premium snapshot-based capability and restore granularly. That's really important in this market, and being able to get your data back quickly and effectively is really important. Now, talking about Microsoft, as you're talking about what Commvault's doing, we do so much more than just M365. But what's important about this is you can have one product that is able to protect all of your data. Not just M365, but all of the different solutions and products that are out there. We have a lot of different categories here on the screen. There's a lot of things that aren't here. This is being updated almost weekly. But you're able to have your other workloads protected in the same secure, safe manner as you would with your Microsoft 365 environment. The beautiful thing is, with the ability of being able to restore your data quickly and effectively, you're able to do it from a single pane of glass. And while your journey is probably unique, everybody has a hybrid cloud journey, and we're able to help you with that journey. Now, I talked a little bit a minute ago about TCO, and a huge benefit of Commvault SaaS is our self-managed software. There's a lot of things you don't have to worry about anymore. Upstart costs, so managing the infrastructure, nothing on-prem that you have to worry about from the M365 standpoint. Everything is in the cloud. The back end is managed by us. The ongoing maintenance is managed. So no more, if there's equipment failures, it's automatically, dynamically maintained and taken care of. No limitations to storage, administration fees. All of those things go away with a single solution that's able to really protect your environment from a scale and security standpoint, which is really, really important into what you're doing today. Now, the crown jewels of security. I talk to a lot of people in my job here at Commvault, and security is really, really important, right? Everybody talks about security. Well, Commvault SaaS is built on zero trust, and our robust infrastructure on the back end is really powerful. Notably, we're the only SaaS protection provider that has achieved the FedRAMP High status. And what really that means is we've taken care of more than 420 security controls that are maintained by the U.S. government. This makes us capable of meeting the most stringent security standards and protocols that's fit for protecting and handling federal data. So if we can protect federal data, we can protect your data. And what we've done has obviously enabled these capabilities, but we're able to share that amongst everybody. And what we've also done is taken as many of those capabilities and put them into the commercial and enterprise products as well. So just because they're federal, you still get a lot of the same secure functionality that the federal teams would. So across the board, whether if it's the foundational level, DevSec approach, air gapping, immutability, threat detection that's built into the product, we've really created a solution that gives you the ability to protect your data securely and always available to make sure that that data is available. Now, with all this being said, I know I've talked a lot in about 10 minutes, but if you're interested in learning more, that's weird. So if you're interested in hearing more, I really encourage everyone to go out and check out Commvault.com. We have a lot of great resources out there. There's on-demand webinars, leadership content, white papers, videos, training, all available at your fingertips. We also have a free trial available, and that free trial gives you a 30-day trial of the M365 product, so you can protect all of your products, Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams, be able to actually see how it works. And we're also available on the marketplace. So if you want to go out and check it out there, there's a lot of information there as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, let's jump right into some viewer questions. First one, can I back up SharePoint and Exchange at the same time? And what about restores?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question. One of the things that people run into with some products is they can only do backup or restore at the same time. So what Commvault has done is we have multiple connections tied to all of the different products. So when you look like Exchange or SharePoint, there's dedicated connections to each one of those. And each of those connections have sub-connections as well. So you can back up and restore at the same time, the same product, multiple products, it really doesn't matter.
Okay, great. Do you compress and or dedupe?
We do. So that's actually a good question too. When we back up the data, we compress and dedupe it before we send it over through the API. So that's very important, especially when you don't need to have the extra data over there if it's already there. Plus, on a restore, you want to make sure that if you need to do a mass restore, it's clean as possible to get the data back.
Great. Let's close it out with this one. Can you protect Azure AD?
Azure AD, that's another great point. Yes. We do also protect Azure AD. We're seeing a lot more of that in the space today. We've been protecting Azure AD for a couple years now. We actually just released a new product that's going to get even more granular for a true DR solution to recover your Azure AD. Because if your Azure AD is not available, nothing's available from an M365 standpoint.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the talk, Brian. And don't forget to check out those resources to learn more about Commvault. And now it's time to announce the winner of a random drawing. Congratulations, Luis Mosca from LPMIT. You have won the GoPro Hero 10. Our team will be in touch with you on how to claim your prize shortly. And that's it for our summit today. Thank you all so much. You will get your replay email in the next few days. We hope you enjoyed this event, and please do take the survey that pops up when you exit. Thank you, and thanks again to CoreView and Commvault. Have a great day.